So thank you everyone for being here today. As Drew mentioned, my name is Jennifer Coyle, and I've been working with the Florida Center for a couple of years now, on and off. And prior to that, a lot of the work that I have done has been with our National Transition Center, where we've done a primary focus there is to support students as they're transitioning from the post-secondary world into what happens after high school. So a lot of the work that I've done and a lot of the work that is being done at the Florida Center intersects in a really great way. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a couple of resources at the Florida Center. And we're going to be exploring what those are. We're also going to be looking at a couple of other pieces and how everything intersects when you're your um, your post-secondary program, your inclusive post-secondary education program. So to start off, we're going to look at the strategic planning tool, which is our online program planning tool for when you're working with your team and how you're going to plan different pieces of that to support your program on your site. Moving forward in this presentation, we'll just refer to it as the tool. We're also going to talk briefly about the program application and the program grant proposal. And as you see, you'll see different links to these different pieces pop up in the chat. And there will be points in time throughout the webinar today where I will be referring to those, but I'll give you a little heads up so you can make sure you have those downloaded, or you at least have the pieces on your computer so you can look at what I'm referring to. So after we talk about those three different program implementation resources, and then we're going to explore, there's two crosswalks that we have, one for program applications and then one for grant proposals. So we'll dig into those in a little bit. And then at the end, we're just going to tie it all together and how all of those different pieces all work together to help you as you're implementing your inclusive post-secondary education program, as you're improving it, ways and strategies that you can use these different pieces just to smooth out the whole process. There's a lot of different moving pieces, and what we wanted to do was make sure that we could connect it all in a way that was meaningful for you, and in the long run, it saves time, and we all are excited about saving time these days. So let's go ahead and jump in. So the first thing that we're going to look at is that post-secondary education component of the planning tool. If you already have a plan in the tool, then if you want, you can go ahead and log into that, or you can just follow along with what I'm going to do. I'm going to take us into the tool in a couple of minutes, and that's totally fine. There's also a place where you can grab a paper copy of it, and that is on the FCSUA's website, and I have the link there. So either way, you can have that information handy if you want, or you can just follow along with what I'm going to give you here in a couple of minutes. We're going to jump right into the tool. But first, what I want to do is give you some background about how that strategic planning tool was created and where it came from. So originally we had there's a K-12 or a secondary transition tool, and that was based on work that was done in the 90s by Paula Kohler. And her work was around finding pieces, finding evidence-based practices, finding things that worked for students with disabilities in high school settings. And all of that information was gathered through different surveys, different ways of getting that information into this tool, and it was created through a taxonomy. So the K-12 secondary transition tool has 5 different pieces in it. And so when we started looking at the post-secondary research and trying to figure out a way to bring all that information together in a meaningful way for practitioners, we were able to develop a post-secondary education tool. The same idea with a taxonomy. So it has 4 different domains in it, and each domain has different benchmarks, which we'll look at in just a couple minutes. But for the post-secondary ed component, we brought together a group of experts that had great knowledge about post-secondary education and what worked for students with disabilities, particularly students with intellectual disabilities at the post-secondary level in college settings, college, universities, career and tech settings, what kind of things worked. We also looked at the original taxonomy for transition programming, the one I just referred to. And then we also looked at what Think College has available. And Think College is the National Coordinating Center for post-secondary programs across the country. And so they have a lot of really great research in these different areas too. So we pulled all that information together. And then from there, we designed the post-secondary education component or the tool. And so you'll see when we go into the landing page of it, there's the secondary transition piece, and then there's the post-secondary education piece to it. And that's where we'll be focusing our time. So the tool it's just loaded with evidence-based practices, promising practices for either the secondary pieces or the post-secondary education pieces. And what that means is, so you don't have to be looking at articles. You don't have to be going out and digging around for what the evidence base is telling you. Those different benchmarks are embedded into the tool as you're using it for program planning. And it really is a tool. So it's meant to be, there's a process to it, but it's also meant to be used to do progress monitoring. It's meant to develop a plan. It's the idea that you're using the different pieces of it to identify where your program is now, or where the gaps are, or what things that are happening in your program are really great, and you want to capture that, with the whole idea that as you're moving through it, you have a really great roadmap for, this is what we're doing now and this is where we want to be. And so at the end of your process through the planning tool, then you have goals and you have a plan, and it's very action oriented around what you're going to do to improve your program, create your program, implement your program within a year. And so you'll notice as you work with the Florida Center, we have opportunities for bringing a team together. We have an institute coming up in a couple of weeks where teams are coming together to work on their plan. And all of that is done within this planning tool system. And we'll look at that again in a couple minutes. And the idea around the program planning is that it's a continuous improvement model. So our design using the taxonomy and design within the tool is that we're always coming back and we're always looking to see if we're making the progress towards our goals. So it's not a, we refer to our capacity building institutes and mid-year checks as it's more than just a sit and get. So you don't come and just get information and walk away with it. You put that information into play. So you build a plan, you build goals around things that are critical to improving what you're doing for students with intellectual disabilities within your plan. So when we think about a continuous improvement, we're always looking, we're always checking, we're always monitoring our progress on our goals that we set for the year, and wanting to make sure that we're moving forward. So within the post-secondary education piece of the tool, there's 4 domains, and within each of those domains, we have benchmarks. So you'll see that we have a student-focused domain, and within that domain, there's 8 different benchmarks. And these benchmarks are pieces where the evidence shows up. These are pieces where we have those promising practices, things that we know work and show outcomes for students in post-secondary education programs. Those are all embedded into these domains as statements. And so when we look at the tool in a couple minutes, you'll see where those are and how they're represented. So we have a student-focused piece, and then we have other pieces too when you're thinking about the big picture of what a post-secondary education program would look like. It would have all of these different domains in it. And when we were developing the tool, we wanted to make sure that you could look at it from 2 ways. You could look at it, if you think about a funnel, and you could look at it from the top down. So the top is that very systems, concepts, development. What are we doing? How are we going to do it? Are the policies at our university, do they support what we want to do? And then as you start to kind of go down the funnel or bring down the focus, you're looking at your program, are you looking at your staff? Are your staff getting the kind of professional development they need in order to support the students that are on campus in the program. Then we look at the student pieces of it. So you can look, when you think about your program, you can look at it in two ways. You can start with the student, and then you're growing the program bigger, or you can start with the concepts and the systems pieces of it and get those kind of hammered out, and then narrow in on what your program really is about, and that's about the students. So in the tool, there are 3 steps. And so the first step is building your team. And what we really, really recommend as you're building a team, particularly if you're new to the Institute model, is that you're bringing a wide variety of people on your team, an interdisciplinary team. And what that means, that probably a couple of people from your institution, that could be someone from your community or from your local high school, depending on what kind of program you're building. You want to make sure that you have the perspectives on your team represented at the table, so you can actually put your plan, your goals, your action plan into place. It's really frustrating when you come together and you spend all that time planning, but you can't get to that next step because you don't have that person on your team that can say, yep, we can do it, or that person on your team that has the answers you need in order to move to the next step. So you're building your team, you're going to capture that in the tool, and then you go into an assessment. And it's a needs assessment. So within those 4 domains, so we'll talk about the student focused domain. Within those different benchmarks, you're going to be talking about which ones apply to where you are with your program. And you're going to look at, are we implementing this particular benchmark? How do we know? What does our data tell us? How do we know that we're actually doing this particular practice? And then you go through the different benchmarks, and then you identify priorities, and your priorities lead right into what your goal will be. And then the third part of it is your planning. This is the good part where you spend a lot of time thinking about what your goal is, what different pieces, as you break your goal down into different tasks, what those different tasks are. I always think of it as, so when you're getting ready, you're following a recipe, right? And there's different steps to how you're going to achieve this goal. That's your task. And then you have your timelines that are plugged into each one of those tasks, and then outcomes, because we don't know what we're accomplishing unless we have outcomes. And we don't know if we've accomplished our outcomes unless we're able to collect data. And how are we evaluating what our progress is, and what are we doing? All of those pieces are within the tool in a very sequential way. So you move from point A, what are we doing, to point B, what are we doing next? How are we going to get there? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint, and then I'm going to take us into, so we can get right into what the tool looks like. And I'll take you through different pieces of that. Hold on a second. I don't want to leave the Zoom meeting. That would not be good. Where did you guys go? There we go. Can you see my the tool?
No, it's still
Not
showing.
yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
How about now? Thank you.
There we go.
It seems like no matter how much you practice it, it never goes the way you want it to go. Okay, here we go. So you'll see on that front page, you will have seen the landing page for the tool, and there's a K-12 component and then a post-secondary component. So we're looking at the post-secondary component. And if you're familiar with the planning, our planning system, you're a returning team, or you've been in the planning system, this will all look really familiar to you. And so what you can do as you're looking, when you come into the tool, and remember, if you're new to the whole process and you don't have a login, we'll give you Claudia's email, and you can reach out to Claudia, and she is the person that will help you get logged in, get a log on into the tool. So just briefly, when you hop in, you'll see there's an overview, and this gives you a good idea of what how the tool was created, different pieces of the tool. So I'm going to go back over to dashboard, and I'm going to just pick a plan for us to go into. Sorry, don't look. Okay, here we go. So what I did is I went into my planning piece of the tool, and we're just gonna walk through the different tabs and the different pieces that are in here. And so these are the 3 steps that I was mentioning before. So this is where, when you're working within your team planning times at the Institute or working with your team, this is where you're building your team. And again, you can capture all different kinds of individuals for your team. So whoever you're bringing that is, my husband uses this phrase a lot. He says the right people in the right seats. So making sure that when you're doing your team planning, that you have the right people in the right seats. And generally what that means to me is that you have people there that can bring a lot of knowledge to the planning process, but then also can bring information, authority, the ability to make decisions about what kind of plan and goals you're going to put together. So here you can see that is step 1. And so then step 2 is where, when you're thinking about working with your team, you're going to be spending a bulk of your time within these different domains, and then also a bulk of your time in step 3 or tab 3, which is the make a plan piece. So since we've been talking about the student-focused pieces, I'm going to stay here. And so you can see that there's different, if you look at this first benchmark, this is a student-focused benchmark. And so then you can also see that there's ways to measure. Have you implemented this practice? How do you know? What kind of evidence, what kind of data do you have that shows that you've implemented this practice? And quite often when I'm working with teams, I recommend that we don't signify a priority yet. I think it's helpful to have the conversations about the different benchmarks and what then the priorities seem to kind of raise to the top. And so you can see as I scroll through here, this particular domain has 8 different benchmarks, and they're all student focused. So what kind of work is a student, what kind of work experiences is a student going to have when they're in your post-secondary education program? What kind of assessments are they going to be doing? Are they able to, or how are they going to talk with their faculty? How are they going to talk with their employers about what kind of accommodations do they need? So these are all areas that, as you're thinking about what kind of goals, what kind of direction you want your plan to go, these are areas that you can decide to focus on. We have one in here about how families are going to be engaged with the student in their particular experience within your setting. And so when you're working with your planning system, your planning team, you will decide which of these domains you want to start in. And that's where this crosswalk that we've been talking, that I've mentioned briefly at the beginning, that's where the crosswalk comes in handy. And we'll look at that again. We'll look at that in more detail in a little bit. But I wanted just to give you a glance at the tool. So you can see these different domains across the top. And as you click through, they show up with the different benchmarks underneath them. The other piece to this planning system is the goal planning pieces. And because I don't have anything developed, I'm just going to click here so that it will show up over here. Or not. But I will show you what the different pieces look like. So when you're working in here, you can work with your goals. And so then when you're writing your goals, what you're going to do is you're going to figure out what your tasks are and what your different pieces are within your goal. And so those goals, as you'll notice as we move forward in our presentation, that your goals are pieces that you'll talk about in your program application. You'll talk about your goals a lot in your grant proposal. And so as you're writing within your plan, your goals and your evaluation and different pieces like that, I'll show you where those connect with your grant proposal and with your program application. So before we leave here, are there any questions? Okay.
Yes, I have a question. Could you go back to Jennifer, step number 2, assess
Yes.
status?
Yes.
So after you put your team together and you said, really having some conversations around these particular benchmarks, is the expectation to fill in the description, current strengths and needs only, or do we have to do that in addition to rate, also use the little stars and rate where we are in that
Yeah,
process?
yeah,
It's
great.
both.
Great question, Diana. Yeah, so when you're working with your team, we recommend that you fill these pieces out with as much comprehension as you can. So yes, so doing the rating and also filling in the description, the strengths and the needs. And those 3 boxes, I think, are the most helpful when you're looking at your plan, when you're coming back to do progress monitoring, or when you're looking at your plan again in a year and you're trying to figure out where you were, what you were doing, at that time. And so when you're working with your team, particularly if you're coming to the Institute in a couple of weeks, you'll be going through a lot of this with your facilitator. And that is the time when you would fill in those stars. So particularly, let's say for this particular benchmark, maybe you already have an inclusive program at your institution. And so, yeah, we can say, yep, we are doing this. We know that this is implemented full bore, right? We're doing it. And what's our evidence? Well, we have 10 students enrolled. We have more students, we have students on a waiting list, different ways of measuring how you would know that you're doing this particular strategy. And then you could also write in here, this is where we have our 10 students that are enrolled. We know that we have other students that are interested. We're currently recruiting students. But our strength here, so our strength maybe is that your program is continuing. And then you can also write in your needs. So yeah, great question. When you're with your team, filling as much information as you can here is really beneficial to you as you move forward and you're doing your progress monitoring. So I'm going to save this.
And they have to save every time so that what they've added saves, and whenever they go to make a plan, that there's actually a plan there. They have to be sure and hit save each time, correct?
Yes. Yep. So, and you'll see there's a prompt after each benchmark, and there's also a prompt at the bottom to make sure that you're saving. And so then when I go into tab 3, and because I checked that spot right there where it said make a plan, what we just did rolled over into my make a plan page. And so you can see that it didn't capture here anything evidence because I didn't select anything, but I did make it a top 3 priority. And any information that you write into these boxes rolls over into the making a goal piece. So if I want to add a new goal here, you have example goals that you can copy and paste if you want. You could drop it in there as a goal starter. These are really more intended to be goal starters as opposed to what your entire goal would be. But let's just say we want to increase our student enrollment. And so then you would come over here and you would start your plan. And so everything that we have input so far, so it has our date. This is from 2019, so the date's not going to be correct. It has your domain area. So this is from your student focused domain area. This is your goal area. And then you can see another piece that you'll do with your team and your facilitators while you're doing planning is you'll create new tasks. And so like I said, the tasks are like the recipe steps. How do we get to that really yummy pan of brownies at the end, right? So we have to put in all of the different steps to how we're going to achieve that. And those goals, the task, we really recommend that those are very specific and very detailed out. We like to see tasks that have one task written in it. I mean, I know that seems kind of counterintuitive or intuitive. However, we've seen tasks where there's lots of different pieces within it. It's really hard to measure those. So when you're thinking about creating a task, making sure that it's one specific thing, or, you know, it could be that we're trying to create or improve our student enrollment. So your first task might be that you want to survey, you know, how many students might be interested, you know. So those are different like pieces to the task as your person responsible. We know through all of our work that if these tasks are more likely to be accomplished if there's a specific person associated with it, not the department or not the office, but a person that's responsible for that. And then when your date is going to be, and then you go through, after you've written in all your tasks, you go through and you develop outputs for each of those. You can put in put in as many outputs or products as you want. And we think about outputs as something that we can touch or look at. Those are things like if you're doing let's say you're doing a job fair. So it might be the attendance sheet at a job fair. That's one that we use a lot, but that's a really good example because it's something you can touch and look at as an output of the work that you've done. And then your outcomes. This is really the critical piece to knowing if you're accomplishing your goal. What kind of outcome do you expect from increasing enrollment? How are you going to measure that, and where are you going to get that information from? So how are we going to measure that our enrollment has gone up, and how are we going to get that information? So really delineating out those pieces then makes it easier for you when you come back in and do progress monitoring to make sure that you can really figure out if you've changed that outcome, if that outcome is being achieved. And then the final pieces to the last, when you're making your goal, are there additional stakeholders? Are there other resources that we need? TA needs. Maybe we need to have Drew come out. We need to have Drew come to our program and give us information about a specific piece that we're working on. Or maybe there's other technical assistance that you can get in order to help you implement that plan. So these boxes go back to, do we have the right people at the right seats, right? So do we have the right people at the right table in order to do what we need? And if not, let's get them down here so we can do a follow-up. And as Drew mentioned, we have save all, like all through here. So as you're working through this at the Institute in a couple weeks, or as you're working through it with your team during a team meeting, making sure that you're saving all, because there's nothing more frustrating than going through all of this work and all this planning equity and having it go away. Any other questions about the tool? Okay, and feel free to drop other ones in the chat if you want, and I will give out my my email too if you have other questions as we go. Okay, so we are going to move forward. So the next two pieces that we're going to talk about are the FPCTP or program application and the FPCT Program Grant proposal. If you don't have those with you, I just gave you the links to get to the website where you can look at the different pieces. The application materials are a zip drive, so there are some things that are, there can be some files when you're downloading those, but those are also in, the links to those are also in the chat. If you don't have them in front of you, that is okay. I'm going to take you through some pieces of them. It's primarily to help you think about the connection between the tool, you're writing out those goals, the outcomes, the outputs, and how those connect to the application and the grant proposal. So when we're thinking about the program application, so when you're ready and you've done the planning process and you're working on pulling together your program application, your application and your grant proposal are totally linked. One of the things that we have spent a lot of time talking about is how connected they are. And so as we go through these slides, you'll notice some things are in bold. For example, this word here, credential, is bolded. So those are things that are in the planning tool. So there's actually a benchmark about credentialing. There are pieces that you have to refer to and talk about how you're going to have your students achieve or receive a credential in your program application. And there's also credentialing questions within the grant proposal piece. So you'll notice as we go through these items that are bolded, these are things that are connected through. And at the end, I'll bring your attention back to those. But as we're going through, particularly the application and the grant proposal piece, there's a lot of really great connections. And what it comes down to is saving time. So your application has to include a credential. And you'll see that throughout the application and also particularly in the grant proposal tool. How is that going to happen for your students? The other piece to your application is your program design. And those are things that you can think a lot about when you're doing your planning, when you're in your planning piece of the tool, is what are things that we are putting into place within our design that we know are evidence-based. And those are the practices in the tool. So we can drop those right into our program design piece of our application to make that connection. So when we're going back into the tool to do that progress monitoring, you're really keeping in line with the design that you have in your application. And the biggest piece, and the reason why we're all creating these programs, right, is that we're making sure that students with intellectual disabilities they're a part of, they're having the experience that everyone is having on campus, that they're integrated, that they're being inclusively involved within your program and within the university. One of the things that we see happening is that we're creating individual unique programs on campus for students within our program. But that's kind of what they've already been doing, right? So when we think about students coming to a university program or a college program, it's about the inclusive experience. It's about the opportunities. It's not about taking something that maybe they were a part of in high school and dropping it onto our campus. So making sure that inclusivity is really high priority as you're designing your program. And you'll see that in the tool, in the application, and then in the grant proposal. So other pieces to your application are those business partnerships with employers, excuse me. How are we making sure that we have lots of opportunities for our students within the program to get, and not only to get work skills, but to have the experience of practicing them. So how do we provide the skills and also the opportunities to practice those skills? Performance indicators. So when we think about the outcomes indicators and data sources pieces of the program planning tool, that's where you're measuring how you're performing. And in your application, when you're writing that out, you have to delineate what your performance indicators are. You can pull those right from your tool. And then also making sure that you're thinking not just about this particular year for enrollment or expectations of the program, but that we're designing out, that we're thinking out 5 years. And this comes from your application. What are your expectations for 5 years? What are your enrollment expectations? So while the program planning process is a yearly cycle, it also helps us to think about what the sustainability and what the next steps are for the program. What we don't want to see happen is that we create a program and then we didn't think forward about how to sustain it, and then it goes away. Other pieces within the application, and you'll see a lot of these are bolded. So these, again, are things that are represented in the program planning tool or in the tool and also within your grant proposal. What kind of assessments are our students going to have? How are we going to know what they're bringing to the program? How are we going to know what they're getting from the program? What kind of structure your program is? Again, those employment opportunities that we just talked about, sustainability, again, thinking out further than a year. The year cycle is to make sure that we're always monitoring our progress, but we also have to think about what comes further out. And so now we're switching into the proposal. So we were just talking about the program application. So now we think about the grant proposal. So if you have a program and you can then apply for a grant to support your program. And oftentimes those might go hand in hand, but really your program application comes first because it's hard to put money into something that doesn't, a program that doesn't or exist, it hasn't been approved yet. So when you're thinking about your grant proposal, you can do that as a startup. So starting up with a new program or enhancing a current program. Those grants can be up to 3 years. And the biggest piece of your grant is that you have to submit an APR, an annual performance report, every year on performance indicators. And these are the things, again, that you talked about how you're going to collect information on that in your application. You also have that information from your tool. So in the tool, when we talked about outcomes, indicators, data sources, those are all things you see here. So number of students enrolled, that's a pretty good indicator of whether or not we're enrolling students, right? How many students do we have? What kind of retention efforts are we doing? And how do we know that those retention efforts are paying out? And so having that information written out as part of your outcome in your tool also is something where you can take that and put it into your proposal. So this isn't an inclusive list of everything that when you're writing your grant proposal, you want to make sure you have, but how many students is your program going to serve? I'm from Michigan and we have a program here that they're a pretty small program and their goal is to serve 10 students. That's okay, that's great. I mean, that's 10 students. You might have other programs that their goal is to serve up to 40 or 60 students. And that's because of demographics, that's because of the size of the institution. There's a lot of things that go into that. So when you're writing your proposal, thinking about how many students you can serve. Then when we think about the different, again, your employment opportunities, so we saw that in the application, we know that's in the tool because employment and paid work is hands down the best indicator of outcomes, successful outcomes for students with disabilities. So all of the research that we know and we think about paid work experiences, the hands down is the best indicator of how students are going to do as an outcome. So that is definitely represented in the tool, it's represented in the application, and it's here in the proposal. So you don't have to duplicate. You can use those pieces that are already in the application of the tool to answer some of the pieces of the proposal. The goals of the program, pull them from your tool, drop them in your proposal. Outputs, outcomes, data sources, all of those pieces are things that are directly linked. And you know, a big reason when you write a goal for having outputs, outcomes, and data sources is because, to be honest, when people decide to grant money, they want to know that their money is doing what you thought it was going to do, right? So we need to have data to show that. We need to know that what we're using that money for is actually something that is being achieved. So when you spend a lot of time in the tool getting all of those pieces ready in your goal planning part, it's really easy to take that and put it into your grant application. Okay, any questions before we go on to the next piece? Okay, so I'm gonna, you have an opportunity to have 2 different crosswalks, and I'm gonna just talk through them a little bit, and then I'll show you a couple of screenshots, and then I will take you into what they look like. I believe they're also in the chat if you want to download. So what we wanted to do, what we realized in all of our conversations is that we want to be able to connect what is in the tool to the application, to the proposal, to our program. And so we developed 2 different crosswalks. So one that crosswalks the program application with the benchmarks in the tool, and then a second crosswalk that takes the pieces of the grant proposal and overlays it on top of the pieces in the tool. So when you're writing your proposal, when you're writing your application, or when you're in the tool and you're just not sure where to start, the crosswalk can help you kind of narrow in on where to start, either in the tool, or it helps you directly pull pieces of the tool out and put them in your application or your proposal. And again, one of the things that is, you'll see it bolded here, and it's throughout everything, is evidence-based promising practices. Benchmarks in the tool, evidence-based. Benchmarks in the tool are promising practices. So those are things that we know there's research that shows those particular practices work for students with intellectual disabilities. And so we should really be focusing on making sure those practices are apparent in our application, in our proposal, which then means they're apparent in our program. So here's a kind of a graphic to think about all of it, because to be honest, it was hard for me to kind of figure out how all of this came together until I could really put it into something that showed me how things flowed together. So you see, we start with the tool and the, the benchmarks, the domains, the program, the planning pieces in there. That's all really, really good information when you're thinking about how you're going to put a program together. And then we have the crosswalks, which we'll look at in a second. So you can use the crosswalks. My husband really wanted me to put in the song from the Beatles that shows them walking across the street at the crosswalk. Like, we're walking through to get to our program. We're walking through the pieces of the planning tool to be able to write our proposal. And so the crosswalk takes different pieces of benchmarks and ties it to these different pieces. And we'll look at that in a second. And if you do all of that, tool, application, proposal, it's all connected. You have a program. And then, as you can see along the bottom, we have a program, and then we come back to the planning piece and the tool. So if you're coming to the Institute in a couple weeks, and then next year when you come back to the Institute, your process and progress through the planning tool may look totally different than it did this year, and that's good. That's what we're looking for. So we want to make sure that you're always monitoring your process and progress in the planning pieces. So then when you're writing your program and your grant, those come together. But let's say it's next year, you're not worried about writing your program application anymore. You're just worried about what the next step is for your program. Then you can come back into the tool and start that process again. So this is the crosswalk for the program application. And I know it's not all that user-friendly, so you have it in print if you have the opportunity to print. And what it does is you'll see across the top, so your program application is in Salesforce, which is this great mechanism for filling out the application. And so you'll see down the left, there's different sections of the application that are in Salesforce. So when you're starting your application, or you've already done it and you're updating, or you're getting ready to start your application, you'll work with the Florida Center to be able to have access to Salesforce when you're ready, and you'll fill out your application. But so these different sections are there within Salesforce. And so what I did is I pulled out the pieces that are represented in the tool. And so you'll see across the top, you have the different domains. So each different domain, and then within the domains, the different benchmarks. So let's look at, we're gonna look here in student focused. And we're gonna look over here where it says program and institution focus. You can see these orange squares. So these are pieces that directly relate from the program and institution focused domain in the tool 3.1 and 3.2 that directly correlate or are related to how will students be recruited to enroll. So one of those benchmarks is all about how are we recruiting students? What's the retention? How are we going to have students enroll? So when you are planning your program and you are thinking about how you want to enroll students, you can go right to this piece. Let's say you're in the program planning piece, right? You're with your team in the next couple of weeks at the Institute, and you're like, man, we really want to figure out how to enroll students. You can go right to this piece, this benchmark in the tool, and focus your time in there. And you also know, if you're getting ready to write your application, that the work that you're doing in that piece in the tool, you can drop it right into your application. And so it automatically, well, not automatically, as Drew said, we would love to have a button where you can just push and it goes right into the application. We don't have that yet, but you can copy and paste and drop it right into your application, maybe with a little wordsmithing, but the connection is there. So you can see as we look at the crosswalk, and I have a little bit bigger piece if you kind of cross section of the crosswalk, but you can see, like, if we're looking at section 3 in Salesforce of the application, the assessment and advising piece, and we are looking specifically at the question in the application around assessments. How are you going to do them? How does it impact the program of study? Those pieces are directly connected to 1.1 and 1.2 of the student focused domain in the tool. So when you want to make sure that what you have in your tool is connected to your application, which is definitely what the Florida Center wants, we want to make sure everything is connected, then you can take that time, you can look at your tool, figure out where you put those pieces in here in section 3 of Salesforce, and it's connected. So now the other crosswalk that we have, and you can tell the difference because one has a black header and one has a brown header. I personally like the other colors on the other one better, but I wanted to make sure they were different enough. So when you look at the, this is the crosswalk, program planning crosswalk for FPCT Program Grant proposals. So the one we were looking at before is applications. So what we did here is we took the pieces of the narrative component from the grant proposal. So when you're writing your grant proposal, these are the things that we want to make sure we have represented in our grant proposal. So demand, we talked about this, this was one of the bolded pieces of the PowerPoint, demand for program, number of students served. Well, you can crosswalk that over here to faculty and student focused domain in the tool and look specifically at this benchmark 2.3. So you're planning with your team, you're at the institute, your team is together, and you're talking about creating a program. How do we know how many students we can actually serve? So you can focus your attention in your planning pieces on the 2.3 benchmark in faculty and staff focused, and know that that directly connects to the pieces in your grant proposal. And again, you can see there's a lot down in like the gray part where it's formative and summative evaluation planning. Look at all of the connections between the planning tool and evaluation. I mean, there no other place within either crosswalk is it so apparent that the stuff that we have in our planning tool directly relates to the pieces that we're putting into our proposal. We want to know, you want to know. Data tells us what we're doing, good or bad. And so when you're writing out those pieces of your grant proposal, your logic model, your outcomes, how are you going to measure all of it? You've already done all that work in your planning tool. So just bring it over, incorporate that into your proposal. Again, here's just a little smaller screenshot, a little more eye-friendly, if you will. But if you're thinking about in the proposal piece, your goals and your approaches, well, the goals are from your planning, your tool, but then you also have other pieces in here, the outcomes, those are all really just totally great information to pull from your plan and put in your proposal. In the long run, we really want to make sure that we're saving time, that we're writing an intentional plan. And if everything is connected, particularly if you're thinking about your grant proposal, you have that annual performance report every year. Everything's connected. So it's really easy to report out on what your indicators are. It's easy to report out if you've met your outcomes because it's been connected to the pieces that you're continually monitoring in your plan. Okay, so making the connection. So one of the things, our goal for this presentation was making sure that we make the connection between the tool, the application, the grant proposal, and how all of that comes together to help you create a program that's intentional and evidence-based. So making sure that we're using those 3 things, the tool, application, and proposal, to create a really great and evidence-based program for students with intellectual disabilities. The evidence-based and promising practices really is what we're talking about. We're talking about how we have a direct link between the evidence that we know works, the benchmarks and the tool, how we're building those into the different pieces, and then how all of that is being captured in our program. Because if we're going to do a program, let's make sure that we know the things we're putting into the program are going to work, or that they have evidence behind them. So back to those bolded items throughout. So common threads between the 3 different things. So we saw a lot about outcomes, performance indicators, outcomes. All of these things, all of these bullets are within all 3 pieces. And at the end, I've added students because I think sometimes we forget why we're doing all of this. Not totally forget, but we get caught up in trying to fill out the form right, or we get caught up in trying to make sure that we have everything reported out right. And really it comes back to the student. So if we're doing these 3 things, we're using these 3 different material resources to create this really great program that's for the students. And that's our intention, is to make sure that what we're putting together is for the students. So making the other really cool piece about the planning process is that it's a progress monitoring process. So you can always go back into it. So Diana, you were asking about your plan. You can always go back into it. You have access to it all the time to go back in and look at it. And, oh yeah, what were my goals again? Oh, right. Okay, let's go back in and look at the goals and the tasks. You can print it out. You can give it to all your team members. And there will be times, 2 times a year, the Institute and the mid-year, where you come back together as a team and you're looking at what you've been doing. Now, we hope that you're doing it in between those 2 times, right? So you're getting together with your team to make sure that you're making progress. But you do have those 2 times where you're coming back in. The mid-year check and connect is all about making sure that you're making progress. And if you're not, let's talk about it. Let's figure out why we're not achieving this particular task, or this outcome just isn't, maybe it's not worded right. Maybe it doesn't actually reflect what you're trying to achieve. That's a perfect time to look at it. So making sure that you're reflecting on your progress, and you can use the planning process, the planning tool to do that. And throughout conversations throughout the rest of the year, you can hop back in and look at it and say, oh yeah, we really did that, or we didn't do that. Maybe it's time to reach out for that technical assistance we knew that we needed. So when you're thinking about your progress monitoring, that we're always thinking about whether we've achieved those goals and what the pieces are to get there if we're working towards them. Okay, so just a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. So this is about the tool. So building an intentional post-secondary transition program. How do we do that with using the tool? So we always recommend that you have 1 to 2, maybe 3 comprehensive goals in the tool. Comprehensive means you have all those pieces filled out: the goal, the tasks, the outputs, the outcomes, indicators, data sources, and other things that you might need in order to make that goal happen. That's a comprehensive goal. Are you implementing evidence-based and promising practices? If you are, what are those? Okay, well, take me back to the benchmarks, right? So I can look at the benchmarks and see what pieces I'm incorporating into my program. And then the big question we get a lot is, where do you start? What domain do you start with? And that's where you can use the crosswalk to figure out what you have currently going on, or maybe you're a brand new program and you want to start at the concept level. So you're trying to generate support within your institution, you're trying to generate a system. Those are things that will help you kind of figure out where you want to start with the domain. But that crosswalk, particularly the one about the program application, really comes in handy for that. And at the Institute, your facilitator will also, if you come to the Institute, your facilitator will help you tune in on where you should be as well within the tool. So building an intentional application. Does your program application align with your plan? does it align with your grant proposal? Because if it doesn't, then we need to go back and figure out how to line it up. The pieces of your plan directly relate to your application. Pieces of your plan directly relate to your application. One more time, right? And they also directly relate to your grant proposal. All of those things. And again, it's about, in reality, saving time. So now with the grant proposal, again, taking the goals you have in your tool and putting them right into your proposal. So you just need to do the work once, maybe it's a little wordsmithing, and using those outcomes and outputs and indicators. Because if you noticed on the grant proposal slide, there's a logic model piece to your grant proposal. Those are the things that are in your goal planning, your goal in your tool. Your goal in your tool is really just a logic model looking differently. So take that information and create your logic model within your grant proposal. And so last couple pieces here, but really we wanted to make sure that when you're thinking, when you're designing, when you're creating or implementing, that you're using evidence-based practices. So using the benchmarks and dropping those into your program. So if you remember, one of the student-focused benchmarks was about assessment. Well, we know that the more information we have about students, the better that we can support them. And evidence shows that as we use different assessments to make sure that we're getting information, the better it is for us to help them create their course of study, the more likely they, that they're going to be able to figure out what kind of their strengths are. We want to be able to support that for students. So using those benchmarks, paid employment, again, that's an easy one to think about as far as evidence-based. There's so much evidence behind it, and it's something that needs to be a part of the program. So using those benchmarks to beef up your program with evidence. So bringing it all back together. So we think about the tool, we use those crosswalks to make sure that we're connecting the different pieces and how we can directly connect our application to the tool, and how we can directly connect our proposal with the work that we've done in a tool, and how those two intersect, the program application and the proposal. And all of that is to design an intentional post-secondary program, post-secondary education program. So did you know you can use all of that planning equity? I don't know if you've heard that term. It's called sweat equity. Like, you have a really good workout and all that sweat equity and how you feel afterwards. So using that kind of same frame of mind, all that planning equity that you put into your tool, the time that you spend with your team talking and discussing and disagreeing and arguing and coming up with a mutual goal, use that energy, that equity, and put it into your application and your proposal. So you've heard me say it a couple times, but it really is about saving time. So take what you've put so much work into creating and drop it into your application and your grant. Then everything is really connected. And the other thing too is the teams that are looking at your applications and your grant proposals, I would think that as those come in and things are more connected, you might be able to start your program sooner, because you're not getting as much back and forth. Well, we need goals that are more directly linked. Okay, so let's do that first. This directly linked because we can pull it from our plan. So I'm just going to say it over and over again. And for the people in the back, your tool is directly connected to your application plus your grant proposal, and all of that equals an intentional post-secondary program, post-secondary education program. So when you're putting all those pieces together, just remember there's a direct link between those three things, three different resources or materials, and how all of that impacts your post-secondary ed program. I think I'm 2 minutes over on my time, but here is the contact sheet with all of the fun little icons, Facebook and Instagram, all those different pieces for getting in touch with the Florida Center. And then I will look at if there's any questions, if anybody has any questions.
If you have any questions, you can put those in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask them out loud. We have plenty of time, Jennifer. We usually go about an hour and a half with everything, and so we're
Oh,
not over. We're good. We're just
great.
right.
Awesome. So I will stop sharing, and then I will also put my email here.
Jennifer, you did a
any-
wonderful job making
you.
the pieces connected, and it's very appropriate for those who are veterans, as well as those who are new and looking at writing an application and grant proposal. And you did a great job making a connection of how the strategic planning tool works. We've received feedback previously how those connections were not as clear, but we hope that this explanation has been done well, and be reminded your facilitators at the PEPI will be prepared to also remind you of the connection. And as you think about, again, your end of the year reports, those of you who are veterans and you're doing your performance reports and you're thinking about how you tell your story, you have done a lot of work, like Jen said, in the strategic planning tool for years. And so we want to make sure we're always going back to make those connections. And so thank you. It was a very good connection, constant connection.